They stripped him naked in the bitter morning cold, dragged him by the ankles through mud thick with piss and blood, and stood him before a crowd that did not cheer, only stared. His limbs trembled, but not from the chill, from the knowing. He had seen this sentence before. He had signed it for others, but never imagined it would be read aloud in his name. 2 soldiers forced his mouth open. One held the jaws wide with an iron hook. The other stepped forward with a blade. The screams echoed off stone walls and into the teeth of the gathering wind. He watched in horror as his genitals were dropped into a steaming pot, cooked just enough to stop twitching. Then came the bowl and the spoon. When he refused, they pinched his nose until he opened his mouth, and they fed him himself. They did not stop there. They tied ropes to his arms and legs, thick ones, rough with blood from the last prisoner. Then came the horses, 4 of them, foaming, black-eyed, whip-scared beasts. The signal was given. The horses bucked and thundered. For a moment his body held, then it tore apart like soaked parchment. His limbs were carried to the 4 corners of the kingdom, nailed to wooden spikes. But this was no madness, no accident of war. This was carefully designed vengeance, arranged by a queen who had been wronged, betrayed, imprisoned, humiliated, and left for dead. Her name was Brunhilde, and this man had underestimated her for the last time. Brunhilde was not born to be feared. She was born to be admired. She was the daughter of Athanagild, the Visigothic king of Hispania, and in her youth she was praised as the perfect embodiment of royal virtue. Beautiful, educated, and raised in a court of golden tiles and Roman law. She was fluent in Latin, skilled in diplomacy, and possessed a steel-cold clarity rare for any woman of the 6th century. But she was not trained for war. She was trained to be a wife. At the age of 31, she was married to Sigebert I, king of Austrasia, a Frankish kingdom carved out of what is now northeastern France and parts of Germany. It was a political marriage, as all royal unions were. But unlike many, this one bloomed into mutual respect. Sigebert was no fool. He saw in Brunhilde not just a queen, but a strategist, a mind that could read maps and motives better than half his war council. Austrasia prospered under their reign. Laws were codified, roads repaired, churches built. The court admired her clarity, the bishops respected her piety, the people adored her poise. But across the Rhine, a serpent stirred. Sigebert's brother Chilperic, the king of Neustria, was a stark contrast to his sibling. Cruel, impulsive, and ravenous for power, Chilperic ruled with more ambition than intellect. He had a reputation for cruelty and paranoia, but even he knew the value of royal alliances. So he too sought a Visigoth bride, Brunhilde's sister, Galswintha. Where Brunhilde was shrewd and steady, Galswintha was tender-hearted and devout. She hated Neustria from the moment she arrived. She found her new husband violent, his court coarse, and worst of all, she found his mistress still living in the palace. Fredegund. Fredegund was not noble-born. She had started as Chilperic's servant, then mistress, then political shadow. She was clever, venomous, and above all, patient. When Galswintha begged Chilperic to send Fredegund away, he smiled and agreed. Days later, Galswintha was found dead in her bed, strangled, with her own bedclothes. There was no trial, no investigation, just a wedding. Chilperic married Fredegund within the week, and in that moment a line of blood was drawn between the sisters. Brunhilde was enraged. She publicly accused Chilperic of orchestrating her sister's murder, and by extension declared Fredegund a usurper and a whore. Sigebert, bound by blood and honor, supported his wife's fury. War between the brothers was no longer a question. It was destiny. Austrasia clashed with Neustria. The 2 kingdoms, both part of the larger Merovingian dynasty, descended into cycles of siege and assassination. Sigebert's armies outmaneuvered Chilperic's. City after city surrendered. Even Paris welcomed Sigebert as king. But in war, victories invite vultures. As Sigebert prepared to finally depose his brother and reunite the kingdom, disaster struck. In 575, just as he was being declared king in a newly conquered city, 2 assassins emerged from the crowd. They carried blades soaked in poison, a calling card of Fredegund, and they struck with surgical precision. Sigebert died in agony. The entire campaign collapsed overnight. Brunhilde, now widowed in enemy territory, was captured and taken prisoner by Chilperic himself. Her husband was gone. Her son, Childebert II, a boy of 5, was left defenseless in a hostile court, and her sister's murderer now stood as her captor. But what Fredegund did next would ignite a vengeance that would consume generations. Chilperic, ever the paranoid fool, sent Brunhilde into exile. But before doing so, he took her daughter, still a child, and married her off to one of his loyal lords. A move that was both humiliating and tactical. It severed Brunhilde's bloodline from power and ensured that her descendants would be controlled by Neustria. Brunhilde spent her exile in agony, not just over her sister's death, her husband's assassination, or her daughter's forced marriage, but over the insult. The message was clear: she was no longer a queen. She was a trophy, a broken pawn, a name to be forgotten. But Brunhilde had no intention of being forgotten. She spent those years not begging, not mourning, but studying, watching, learning the weaknesses of her captors, and waiting for the moment history would offer her a blade. It came sooner than she expected. Chilperic was murdered in 584, a blade in the dark, a single clean stroke, no witnesses. Fredegund, now queen regent to her son Clothar II, seized power, and suspicion immediately fell on Brunhilde's surviving allies. She was blamed once again, this time without proof, and the feud deepened. But the chaos of Chilperic's death gave Brunhilde the leverage she needed. With Austrasia in disarray and Neustria distracted, Brunhilde returned to reclaim her place beside her son, now old enough to rule, but still under her shadow. And she did not return meekly. Brunhilde re-entered the royal court with steel in her spine and a list of names in her hand. Names of those who had betrayed her during her exile. One by one, they began to vanish. Some were exiled, others were executed. Nobles whispered of poison, of knives in the dark, of messengers found strangled with their own parchment. Austrasia was hers again, and this time she ruled it not as a consort, but as its mind, its will, and eventually its fury. But Neustria had not forgotten, and neither had Fredegund. But vengeance, like a sword kept too long in flame, can twist the hand that wields it. As Brunhilde re-established her grip on Austrasia, her rule hardened. Her son, Childebert II, once a boy clinging to her leg in fear, now stood as king in name, but the real power was hers. She governed with intelligence, yes, but with fire behind the eyes. Every whisper of disloyalty was extinguished with silence, coin, or death. The nobles watched, some obeyed, others plotted. Then in 595, Childebert died. He was only 25. Some said illness. Others murmured poison. No proof was ever found, but in Brunhilde's world, coincidence was a myth. With his death, power passed to her two grandsons, Theudebert II of Austrasia and Theuderic II of Burgundy. The realm was now split between brothers, and once again, Brunhilde stood behind the throne, ready to guide, manipulate, and, if necessary, dominate them both. But the blood she had spilled, the purges she had ordered, they left a trail. The Austrasian nobles, tired of her shadow rule and fearing for their own necks, banished Brunhilde from court. Not once, twice, and twice she returned. She would not die in exile. She would not be dismissed. Each time they cast her out, she wormed her way back through alliances, marriages, or political threats. She leaned into her role as matriarch of a dynasty, binding her fate to her grandsons, even as they grew to resent her. The two boys turned on each other. In a tragedy that played out like an ancient myth, the realm once again broke into war. Not between foreign kings, but brother against brother, each backed by factions of nobles, bishops, and mercenaries. And as war tore the empire apart, Brunhilde chose a side. Theuderic II. She whispered into his ear, advised his every move, pushed him toward war with his brother, urging him to prove his strength, to unite the empire, to cut out the weakness that Austrasia had become. At her insistence, Theuderic declared war on Theudebert, his own brother. Cities burned, castles fell, blood-soaked fields where once only kings had played. And in 612, Theudebert II was captured. Brunhilde gave the order. Theudebert and his young son were executed, the boy strangled in his sleep, the king drowned in a tub like a disobedient dog. Theuderic now ruled both Austrasia and Burgundy. But power, like fire, needs fuel, and Brunhilde was still feeding it. Theuderic, still in his 20s, fell ill. Some say it was dysentery. Others believed he had been poisoned. Again, the name on every tongue was Brunhilde. He died gasping, and with his final breath left behind 4 sons, all children. Once again, a power vacuum opened, and once again, Brunhilde stepped in to fill it. This time as regent for her great-grandson, Sigebert II. She was now an old woman, 70. Frail in body, but fierce in mind, and perhaps too fierce. She began purging again. Bishops who questioned her were replaced. Nobles loyal to Theudoric's court were executed or exiled. She appointed Duke Protadius, a ruthless and unpopular noble, as mayor of the palace, essentially her enforcer. Protadius ordered taxes increased, arrests without trial, and a return to central control, all in her name. The army mutinied. Protadius was assassinated by his own soldiers, yet Brunhilde pressed on. In her mind, only she could preserve the legacy of her dynasty. The great-grandsons were too young, the nobles too treacherous, and the people too fickle. Only she had seen all the betrayals, survived all the wars, and understood what it meant to rule with steel. But across the fractured empire, a familiar shadow moved. Fredegund was dead, but her son, Clothar II, was not. He had survived the collapse of Neustria, grown in the silence, and now, with Brunhilde overextended and unpopular, he made his move. In 613, he marched on Austrasia. Brunhilde gathered what forces remained, but the nobles, exhausted by decades of blood and fearful of dying with her, turned on her. They handed her over to Clothar without a single battle. No trial, no council, no negotiation. Just betrayal. With her capture, the entire story that had begun with 2 sisters and 1 murder came crashing to its final act. Clothar had waited his whole life for this moment. The woman who had outlived his mother, his uncles, his cousins, the woman blamed for every death in the royal line, was now in chains. But chains were not enough. He would not behead her. That was too swift. He would not strangle her. That was too silent. He would make an example. Brunhilde, once queen, once empress, once the most feared woman in all of Francia, would die a death so complete, so humiliating, that no woman would dare rise again as she did. They brought her out at dawn. The sky was colorless, the wind tore at her hair like an animal. She did not beg, she did not cry. She had buried husbands, outlived assassins, burned through empires. Now, at 70, she stood accused of a list of crimes longer than any document could bear. The accusations? Murder of 10 kings, witchcraft, incest, treason, and worst of all, ambition. There was no trial, only spectacle. Clothar too ordered her bound in irons and paraded before the army she had once commanded. The soldiers spit at her. Some wept, others averted their eyes. This was not a queen. This was vengeance made flesh. They stripped her to the waist, tied her arms and legs to 4 horses, and forced her onto a raised wooden platform outside the city of Renave. The crowd gathered in silence. They had never seen a woman executed like this. Not even the worst whores or witches had been granted such attention. The signal was given. The horses were whipped. At first her body held. The crowd gasped. Then, the right leg snapped away. Her scream was immediate, raw, human. The left followed, the arms next, one, then the other. Her blood sprayed across the platform, soaking the wood. The horses panicked and ran. What remained of Brunhilde was no longer recognizable. They say her head detached last, dragged by her hair behind the horse that wouldn't stop galloping. The limbs were collected, and they were sent to the 4 corners of the Frankish kingdom, nailed to wooden pikes in cities that had once bowed to her. It was not just a death, it was a warning. But Clothar wasn't finished. He demanded that all of Brunhilde's closest allies be executed as well. Every supporter, every noble, every servant who had once sworn to her bloodline. Among them was a man named Protadius, her brutal enforcer, and Clothar saved him for something special. Mini shock number 8, genital mutilation execution. They dragged Protadius before the crowd, not with the others, not by sword or rope. He was beaten until unconscious, then revived with vinegar and salt poured into his wounds. Then came the knives. They cut off his genitals in full view of the public, slowly, methodically. The crowd did not cheer. Some turned away. What came next was so savage, it left even Clothar's own men shaken. They placed the severed genitals in a bowl, cooked them over a fire, and then forced the barely living Protadius to eat them. He choked, he screamed, he begged to die. Only then did they tie him to the wheel and break every bone in his body with hammers until his limbs curled like burning paper. Others were burned, hanged, dismembered. Heads were displayed on city gates. Clothar's message was clear. Loyalty to Brunhilde was a curse, a stain that would follow you past death. But the stain could not be erased, because even in death, Brunhilde's shadow loomed. She had ruled 3 generations, advised kings, controlled armies. She was not simply a queen, She was a system of power that had learned to survive in a man's world by becoming more brutal than the men who built it. And in her death, that brutality echoed. Clothar II would go on to rule the united Frankish kingdom. But he would never know peace. His nobles feared him, his people distrusted him, and he spent the rest of his reign haunted by whispers of the queen he dismembered. Brunhilde's name became a cautionary tale, not just of cruelty, but of what happens when a woman dares to rule like a king and does it better. History would not mourn her. The chroniclers, almost all men, called her wicked, a sorceress, a corrupter of kings. They wrote of her beauty as if it were poison, of her mind as if it were a weapon, and of her ambition as if it were a disease. They reduced her to whispers and warnings, a shadow lurking behind the fall of every king she touched. But read carefully, and another Brunhilde emerges. She was a queen who buried a husband, a sister, 2 children, and 5 grandsons, and still stood. She survived civil war, exile, imprisonment, assassination, and humiliation. And not only survived, she ruled. She held kingdoms together with iron and gold when kings crumbled. She made decisions that killed, yes, but always to defend a bloodline in a world where blood was the only currency. Did she murder? Certainly. Did she betray? Likely. Did she deserve to be torn apart by horses? History answers that with silence. But there is no silence in her legacy, because long after her body was scattered, her image remained, feared, reviled, remembered. She haunted the bloodline of kings and the ambitions of queens. Her name was taught to princesses not as a lesson in glory, but as a warning. Be careful not to become another Brunhilde. But perhaps the question is not whether she became a monster. Perhaps the question is, what choice did the world leave her? A queen who ruled too long, fought too hard, and punished too many, but only because she dared to play the same brutal game her male rivals had always played. And for decades, she won. She wasn't undone by failure, she was undone by success. And if that frightens you, good. Because history was never meant to make you comfortable. And this was only one queen, there were others. Crueler, stronger, darker. If you thought Brunhilde was terrifying, wait until you meet the woman who bathed in the blood of 600 girls just to stay young forever.